stood in front of the bathroom mirror at the courthouse, adjusting Emma's pink dress for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The dress, Emma's favorite with its delicate white lace collar and tiny pearl buttons, hung slightly loose on her daughter's small frame, made a mental note that Emma had lost weight, another consequence of the trauma that had stolen so much from her in the past 6 months. She bent down and smoothed back her daughter's golden hair, the same shade had as a child, into a neat ponytail tied with a matching pink ribbon. Emma stared blankly at her reflection in the mirror, her large blue eyes vacant and distant, as if she were looking through the glass at some invisible world only she could see. 3 years ago, when Emma was born, had held her in the hospital and made a silent promise. She would protect this child. She would give her a happy life filled with safety, love, and every opportunity to thrive. She had imagined birthday parties with elaborate cakes, school plays, teenage heartbreaks, and college graduation ceremonies. She had dreamed of the kind of mother-daughter relationship that would sustain both of them through life's inevitable challenges. But dreams were fragile things, had learned. They could shatter in seconds. 6 months ago, Emma had been a completely different child. She'd been the kind of 3-year-old who woke up singing, who asked questions about everything: why the sky was blue, where birds went asleep, what clouds were made of. She had a vocabulary that amazed friends and family. She memorized songs after hearing them twice. She told elaborate stories about imaginary friends named Sparkle and Rainbow. She was affectionate, curious, and full of the kind of infectious joy that made strangers smile. Emma had been a light. Then came that day at Riverside Park. Felt her throat tighten at the memory. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, something her own therapist had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Ground yourself in the present. Don't let the past consume you. But the past was here now in this courthouse bathroom, wearing a pink dress and staring into nothingness. "Emma, sweetheart," whispered, kneeling down to her daughter's level. She took the small hands in her own, they felt so fragile like bird bones, and looked directly into those vacant blue eyes. "I need you to listen carefully. Today is a very important day, okay? There's going to be a room full of people and it might feel a little scary, but Mommy will be right there and you won't be alone. Do you understand?" Emma's eyes flickered for just a moment, a brief spark of recognition that her mother was speaking to her. Then she looked away, back at the mirror, back into that unreachable place where she spent most of her time now. Emma opened her mouth slightly and held her breath, hopping desperately, achingly hopping, that words would come. But nothing emerged. The silence that had become Emma's constant companion remained unbroken. This was what had destroyed most thoroughly. Not the violence she had witnessed, though that had been traumatic enough. Not the broken ribs and bruised face she'd endured, though the physical pain had been real. Not even the dissolution of her marriage to a man she had once loved. No, what had shattered soul was watching her brilliant, vibrant daughter withdraw into silence and shadow. The selective mutism, as Dr. Sarah had explained it, was her daughter's mind's way of protecting itself. Emma's psyche had essentially decided that if she didn't speak about the trauma, maybe it wouldn't be real. If she didn't give voice to what she'd seen, perhaps she could pretend it never happened. But it had happened, and pretending wasn't making it go away. Stood up and took her daughter's hand. It felt small and cold in her grasp. As they prepared to leave the bathroom and head toward the courtroom, Emma's mind replayed the conversations she'd had with the legal team over the past months. Attorney David, no relation to Judge, had been blunt during their last meeting. "Without Emma's testimony, we're vulnerable," he'd said, spreading his hands across his mahogany desk in frustration. "We have officer statements and your account of events, but a good defense attorney, and Richardson is good, will argue reasonable doubt. He'll paint this as a domestic dispute that got out of hand, rather than deliberate violence against you in front of your child. He'll argue the officers overreacted. He might even suggest you provoked James and are now using Emma as a pawn in the custody battle." The thought made blood boil. She had never, not once, tried to manipulate her daughter. Every therapy session, every gentle conversation had been aimed at one thing: helping Emma heal. Would have given anything, literally anything, to spare her daughter this pain. The courthouse hallway was a blur of neutral paint colors and institutional fluorescent lighting. People in business suits hurried past them, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of professional detachment. Spotted James's lawyer near the courtroom entrance, deep in conversation with an investigator. She felt her muscles tense. She pulled Emma closer, protective, shielding her from the crowd. As they approached the courtroom doors, his heart was hammering so violently she worried everyone could see it through her blouse. She'd been warned that today might not yield results. Children this traumatized sometimes cannot testify, doctor had explained. The anticipation alone can cause them to shut down further. But there was also hope, slim, fragile hope, that somehow, someway, Emma's voice might find its way back to her, that the words locked inside her traumatized mind might be released. Judge was already in her chambers, reviewing case files and contemplating the unconventional approach she'd approved. Officer Martinez was in the hallway outside, running Duke through a final calming exercise. And James was in the holding area, wearing an expensive suit his lawyer had chosen specifically for its non-threatening appearance, confident that he could manipulate his way through another day in court. But didn't know about these details yet. All she knew was that she was about to walk into that courtroom with her silent daughter, and somehow, against all odds, they would need to find a way to break through the walls trauma had built. She knelt down one more time, caught Emma's attention, and whispered words of encouragement neither of them fully believed in. "We're going to be okay," said, more to herself than to her daughter. "Somehow we're going to get through this. I promise you, baby, I promise." Emma's blank stare didn't change, but as they stood in the hallway outside the courtroom doors, felt something shift inside her. A mother's fierce determination. A refusal to let the man who had hurt her also destroy her daughter's future. She squeezed Emma's hand and pushed open the heavy courtroom door. Whatever happened in the next few hours would change everything. Just had to hold on long enough to get her daughter safely to the other side. The morning of June 15th had started like any other Saturday. Had woken to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, the chirping of birds outside, and the distant sound of cartoons playing downstairs. Emma had gotten up early, as she often did, and settled herself in front of the television with a bowl of cereal, her small feet tucked under her as she watched the animated characters dance across the screen. It was a peaceful, ordinary morning, the kind that would later realize she had taken completely for granted. She had showered, dressed in comfortable jeans and a light blue blouse, and made herself a cup of coffee. She'd even taken a moment to sit on the back porch with her coffee and a book, enjoying the rare quiet before Emma demanded her attention for 1,000 different reasons. She had no idea that this was the last ordinary day of her life. The custody arrangement had been established by the court 3 months earlier, following the initial separation agreement. Had primary custody, with James receiving Emma every other weekend and one weekday evening. The handoffs were supposed to occur at Riverside Park, a neutral location with playground equipment and open space, always at 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoons. Had chosen the park specifically because it was public, because there were usually other families around, because she'd felt safer there. In retrospect, it hadn't mattered where they were. Trauma didn't discriminate based on location. Had arrived at Riverside Park at 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes early as she always was. She preferred to be early, to have Emma settled and calm before James arrived, to establish a sense of control in a situation that had already spiraled so far beyond her control. The park was moderately busy. A few children played on the playground equipment, their parents watching from nearby benches. A couple jogged along the tree-lined path. Had taken Emma to the swings, and her daughter had squealed with delight as pushed her higher and higher, the late afternoon sun warming their skin. Emma had laughed, a sound that seemed impossible now, a sound that belonged to another lifetime. "Higher, Mommy, higher," Emma had demanded, her small hands gripping the swing chains. "You're going to touch the sky, sweetheart," had called back, pushing with all her strength, remembering what it felt like to be a mother of a happy child. At exactly 2 p.m., James's black SUV had pulled into the parking lot, had felt the familiar tension start to build in her shoulders. Over the past few months, the handoffs had become increasingly strained. James had grown more bitter about the divorce proceedings, more argumentative about custody arrangements, more hostile toward. Their marriage had failed not with a bang but with a series of small betrayals, accumulated resentments, and fundamental incompatibilities that had finally become impossible to ignore. But the separation had transformed James from a man she'd once loved into someone she didn't recognize anymore. Anger had consumed him entirely. Had slowed the swing to a stop and helped Emma down, smoothing her daughter's sundress and taking her hand. They'd walked toward the parking lot to meet James. That was protocol. The custody agreement had been very specific about the procedures. The receiving parent should not have to exit their vehicle. The exchanging parent should bring the child to the car. Had followed the rules religiously, hoping that by maintaining these formal procedures, she could keep the tension at a manageable level. James had stepped out of the SUV before and Emma reached him. That was unusual. He typically waited in the vehicle until Emma was close enough to climb in. His jaw was clenched, and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. Had immediately sensed danger. She'd learned to read her ex-husband's moods like a survival mechanism. The way his shoulders were hunched, the vein that was beginning to pulse in his temple, the hard glint in his eyes, all of it screamed that he was barely holding his anger in check. "You're poisoning her against me," he had said before even had a chance to greet him. His voice was low and menacing, barely controlled fury vibrating in every word. "Emma told me last week that she didn't want to come to my house. She said you told her I was mean. You've turned my own daughter against me. You've made her hate me." His heart had begun to race. She'd gripped Emma's hand, feeling her daughter's small fingers clutch back, sensing the tension in the air even if she didn't understand its source. "James, that's not true," had said, keeping her voice calm, using the same measured tone she'd learned in therapy. "Emma loves you. She's just been struggling with the separation like any child would be." "You're a liar," James had spat. He'd stepped closer, invading personal space in that aggressive way that had become his trademark during their final months together. "You've always been a liar, and now you're using Emma as a weapon against me in this custody battle. You're trying to take her away from me permanently." Had instinctively backed away, pulling Emma with her. "James, please don't do this. Not here. Not in front of Emma." She'd glanced around, hopping to catch the eye of one of the other parents, wondering if anyone was paying attention. She'd noticed 2 police officers standing near the park entrance. They looked like they might be on patrol or taking a break. She'd considered calling out to them, but she hadn't wanted to escalate the situation. "I'm her father," James had continued, his voice growing louder, his fists tightening. "I have rights, and you're destroying everything by poisoning her mind against me." "Nobody's being poisoned," had said, trying once more to de-escalate. "Let's talk about this later, okay? When Emma's not here, when we can have a real conversation about how she's feeling." But James wasn't interested in conversation. His rage had reached a breaking point. The words had stopped coming, replaced by action. He'd stepped forward again, closing the distance between them. Had turned her body to shield Emma, still gripping her daughter's hand. And then, with a force that had taken her breath away, James's hand had connected with the side of her face. The impact had been shocking. Had staggered backward, her cheek exploding with pain, stars dancing in her vision. For a moment she couldn't process what had happened. Did he really just hit me? In front of everyone? In front of our daughter? Emma's screams had started immediately. A high-pitched wail of terror and confusion that would haunt nightmares for months to come. "Mommy, Mommy, no, Daddy, stop," Emma had cried, trying to pull away, her small body shaking with panic. The 2 police officers had noticed immediately. They'd begun running toward them, had fallen to her knees, her cheek throbbing, tears streaming down her face from the pain and the shock and the horror of what was happening. James had started to turn toward Emma, either to grab her or to try to force her into his vehicle, would never be entirely sure of his intention, but the officers had reached them by then. "Step away from the child. Now," one of the officers had commanded, his hand moving toward his weapon not in a threatening way but in a controlled, professional manner that indicated this was a serious situation. James had resisted at first, his rage making him irrational, but the second officer had moved in with practiced efficiency, and within moments James had been on the ground, his arms being restrained behind his back. Emma had been screaming continuously, a sound of pure trauma that had broken something fundamental inside. The officers had been trying to assess the situation, trying to understand what had happened, but Emma's terror had been overwhelming. A third officer, a woman, had tried to comfort Emma, but the child had rejected all attempts at soothing. She'd wanted only her mother, and despite her own pain and shock, had pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her, whispering that it was okay, that she was safe, that mommy was there. But even as the words had left her lips, had known they weren't true. Nothing was okay. Emma wasn't safe, not in the way that mattered, and something fundamental had broken inside her daughter that afternoon, something that wouldn't be easily repaired. The police had arrested James on the scene, had been taken to the hospital for photographs of her injuries and a medical evaluation. Emma had been evaluated by a child protection specialist, and the seeds of Emma's silence had been planted in that moment, deep, traumatic seeds that would grow into a fortress of mutism that would take months of therapy and intervention to penetrate. Dr. Sarah's office was designed with deliberately calming elements. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and original artwork depicting peaceful landscapes hung at intervals. A small fountain bubbled gently in the corner, and soft instrumental music played at a volume just barely perceptible. The furniture was comfortable without being ostentatious. Two upholstered chairs positioned at an angle that suggested conversation rather than interrogation. Everything about the space had been intentionally created to make traumatized individuals, particularly children, feel safe. Had been coming to this office for 3 months now, first with Emma for her sessions, and increasingly for joint appointments where Doctor worked with both of them. Today's appointment, however, was just. She sat in one of the comfortable chairs, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her jeans. Dr. Sarah sat across from her, notepad in hand, her expression conveying the kind of calm professionalism that came from decades of working with trauma survivors. Behind her wire-rimmed glasses, her intelligent brown eyes held both compassion and clinical assessment. She was in her mid-50s, with streaks of gray running through her black hair, and possessed a quiet authority that made people want to trust her immediately. "How are you doing this week?" Doctor began, her voice soft but steady. It was her standard opening question, the same one she asked every session. Had learned that the answer to this seemingly simple question was never simple at all. "I'm exhausted," admitted, leaning back in her chair. Dark circles shadowed the skin beneath her eyes. She'd lost weight over the past 3 months, not from intentional dieting, but from the kind of stress-induced appetite suppression that made eating feel impossible. Her clothes hung a bit loose on her frame. "I don't sleep well anymore. I keep replaying that day at the park over and over in my head. And Emma's voice cracked. Emma still hasn't spoken more than 5 words since it happened. I'm terrified that she might never talk again. That's what one of the articles I read said, that some children never fully recover from selective mutism. What if I've permanently broken my daughter?" Doctor leaned forward slightly, her expression never changing. This was territory they'd covered multiple times before. "I want to remind you of something we've discussed. You did not break Emma. The trauma broke her, yes, but that's a crucial distinction. You have done everything right. You got her to safety. You sought professional help immediately. You're consistent and loving and present. That's the foundation upon which healing will be built." Wanted to believe her. She desperately wanted to believe that love and good intentions would be enough to repair the damage her daughter had sustained. But the skeptical part of her, the part that had been growing louder over the past weeks, wondered if faith in psychology and therapy was just another form of magical thinking. Could talking about trauma really undo the neurological damage that witnessing violence had done to a 3-year-old's developing brain? "Tell me what selective mutism actually is," said, pressing the question that had been haunting her. "I've read the definition 100 times, but I don't really understand it. I don't understand why Emma's mind would choose silence. Why wouldn't she want to talk about what happened? Why wouldn't she want to tell her mother how she's feeling?" Doctor set down her notepad and clasped her hands together thoughtfully. Selective mutism is a complex anxiety disorder, often appearing in children who experience significant trauma. Think of Emma's mind as a protective mechanism. Her brain experienced something deeply frightening and harmful. She watched her father commit an act of violence against her mother. That's an enormous violation of safety for a child. Her developing mind couldn't process it in a healthy way, so it essentially said, "If I don't speak about this, maybe it won't be real. Maybe if I'm silent, I can make the bad thing go away." "But silence won't make it go away," said, frustration creeping into her voice. "Nothing will make it go away, and Emma's silence is making everything worse. The legal case is suffering. James's attorney is arguing that without Emma's testimony, we can't prove what really happened. He's suggesting that maybe I'm exaggerating, that maybe the officers overreacted. And meanwhile, my daughter is locked inside her own mind, unable to communicate even basic needs sometimes." Doctor nodded, acknowledging frustration. "You're right. The silence does complicate things, but I want to explain what's happening. When a child experiences trauma, particularly trauma involving violence and threat, their amygdala, the fear center of the brain, becomes hyperactive. Meanwhile, area, the part of the brain responsible for language production, essentially shuts down. It's not that Emma doesn't want to talk. It's that her traumatized brain literally cannot access the neural pathways necessary for speech about the traumatic event. Listen, trying to absorb this information, trying to let it settle into her understanding. So when will she be able to talk again? How long does this typically last?" "That varies significantly," Doctor said carefully. "Some children overcome selective mutism within weeks. Others take months or even years. Emma's case is complicated by the severity of what she witnessed and her young age. The younger the child, the more difficult it can be for them to process trauma verbally. Their language centers are still developing. They lack the cognitive framework to understand and articulate complex emotions and events." Felt despair settling in her chest like a weight. So there's a real possibility that Emma might never be able to testify about what happened. That James might get away with what he did because my daughter's mind won't let her talk about it. "That's a concern," Doctor admitted, and appreciated her honesty. Doctor was never one to offer false reassurance. "Your attorney is aware of this possibility, I assume?" "Yes, he's been very clear that the case is precarious without Emma's testimony. He has the officer statements and photographs of my injuries, but James's attorney is arguing reasonable doubt. He's claiming that officers overreacted to a simple domestic dispute, that I might have provoked James, that I'm now using Emma as a pawn in the custody battle." Hands clenched into fists. "It's infuriating. I have bruises and a fractured rib to prove he hurt me. But apparently, that's not enough for the legal system." Doctor leaned back, and her expression became more serious. "I want to be honest with you about something. I've been working in child psychology for 30 years. I've seen many cases of childhood trauma, many cases of selective mutism. And I want to be very clear. Emma cannot and should not be pressured to testify. The damage that could be done by forcing a traumatized child to speak before she's ready could set back her healing by months or years. Therapeutic progress has to move at the child's pace, not the legal system's pace." "I know," said quietly. "I would never force her. I would never want to hurt her more than she's already been hurt. But I also want justice. I want James to face consequences for what he did, and I want the law to recognize that what he did was wrong, so that maybe he won't have custody rights that would put Emma back in his presence." "I understand," Doctor said gently. "That's a legitimate desire. But let me ask you something. What would truly help Emma right now? What would be most beneficial for her healing?" "Thought about this. Stability, consistency, time, a sense of safety, someone to help her understand that what happened wasn't her fault, that Daddy's actions weren't something she caused." "Exactly," Doctor said. "All of those things will happen whether or not there's a conviction. A conviction might provide you with closure and validation, but it won't necessarily help Emma heal. In some ways, pushing for a conviction through Emma's testimony might actually harm her healing process by her." Felt tears beginning to form. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on her. She wanted justice. She wanted her daughter to be okay. She wanted to go back in time and prevent any of this from happening. But none of those things were possible. "What do I do?" asked, her voice breaking. "How do I make this right?" "You focus on Emma's healing," Doctor said firmly. "You work with her therapist. You maintain consistency and safety. You model emotional regulation and healthy coping. And you trust that eventually, if Emma feels safe enough, her voice will return. It may or may not happen in time for the legal proceedings, but either way, your daughter will heal. That's the outcome that truly matters." Nodded slowly, accepting this wisdom even as her heart ached for the mother in her who wanted to fight and win and protect her child through the legal system's mechanisms of justice. Judge sat in her chambers on a Wednesday afternoon in late August, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she reviewed the custody case file for what felt like the 100th time. Her mahogany desk was organized with the precision of someone who had spent 23 years in the judicial system, case files arranged in neat stacks, a computer monitor angled just so, a photograph of her late husband smiling at her from a silver frame. The chambers were quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sound of footsteps in the courthouse hallway outside her door. Judge was nearing 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and an air of quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. She had presided over countless family law cases, divorces, custody disputes, domestic violence hearings. She'd seen marriages dissolve in acrimony. She'd witnessed the destruction that occurred when love turned to hatred. She'd made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of children over her career. But something about the case had lodged itself under her skin in a way that most cases didn't. It wasn't the violence itself. She'd seen domestic assault cases far more severe than this one. It wasn't the custody dispute. Those were routine in family court. It was the little girl. 3-year-old Emma, with her golden hair and vacant blue eyes, locked away in a silence so profound that no therapy, no medication, no traditional intervention had been able to penetrate it. Judge had read the psychological evaluation. She'd reviewed the therapeutic notes. She'd studied the legal precedents and the standard procedures for obtaining testimony from traumatized children. And she'd come to the conclusion that standard procedures weren't going to work here. The prosecution had requested an expedited trial date. Without Emma's testimony, the case was weakening. James' defense attorney had been filing motions suggesting that the case lacked sufficient evidence, that the officers had overreacted, that without the child's testimony, reasonable doubt was essentially guaranteed. Judge understood the prosecution's dilemma. She also understood frustration. A mother who had been assaulted, whose child had been traumatized, watching her abuser potentially escape meaningful consequences. But forcing Emma to testify before she was psychologically ready would be wrong. Judge had seen what happened when children were pushed to articulate trauma before they were ready. The regression in therapy, the deepening of the psychological wounds. She wasn't willing to sacrifice Emma's mental health on the altar of legal procedure. There had to be another way. Judge had been thinking about this problem for weeks. She'd read articles about trauma-informed approaches to child testimony. She'd reviewed research on alternative methods for helping children communicate. And then, during a community outreach meeting at the police station, a routine event where judges and law enforcement occasionally gathered to discuss mutual concerns, she'd learned about the police department's new community program. Officer Martinez had been presenting on community policing initiatives when he'd mentioned the therapy dog program. He'd shown photographs and videos of a German shepherd named Duke, a remarkable animal trained specifically to help people in crisis. Judge had listened with increasing interest as Martinez described Duke's training, his deployment to disaster scenes and crisis centers, his ability to sense emotional pain and respond with calm, steady presence. And then an idea had crystallized in her mind. What if a child in therapeutic crisis had access to an animal companion during testimony? What if the animal's presence could serve as an emotional anchor, allowing the traumatized child's brain to feel safe enough to access speech? Judge had requested a private meeting with Officer Martinez. They'd met in her chambers on a Tuesday morning, and Martinez had brought photographs and documentation of Duke's training and experience. The officer was younger than Judge had expected, mid-30s, with a calm demeanor that suggested he was accustomed to working with anxious beings, both canine and human. "Has Duke ever been in a courtroom before?" Judge had asked. "No, Your Honor," Martinez had replied. "But I've worked with him in hospitals, crisis centers, disaster scenes. I've seen what he can do. He has an uncanny ability to sense when someone is in distress and respond with exactly the right kind of presence. Not intrusive, not demanding attention, just there, steady, calm, present." "And you think he could help a traumatized 3-year-old testify?" Judge had leaned back in her chair, considering this. "I think it's worth trying," Martinez had said carefully. "Look, I'm not a psychologist or a judge. I'm just a cop who works with a remarkable dog, but I've seen Duke help people in ways that traditional interventions couldn't. There's something about the non-judgmental presence of an animal that breaks through in ways that human interaction sometimes can't." Judge had made her decision then. She would approve this unconventional approach. It would require coordination with the prosecution, consultation with Emma's therapist, careful preparation. But it was worth trying. The alternative, allowing James to potentially escape consequences while his daughter remained locked in trauma-induced silence, was unacceptable. Now, reviewing the case file one more time, Judge made notes in the margins. She would schedule a pretrial hearing. She would formally propose the therapy dog accommodation. She would ensure that every legal safeguard was in place. She would consult with doctor to ensure that Emma's therapeutic needs were being prioritized. But she was committed to this path. Judge had learned over her 23 years on the bench that justice wasn't always served by rigid adherence to procedure. Sometimes, real justice required creativity, compassion, and a willingness to think outside traditional frameworks. The law was a tool meant to serve human flourishing, not an end in itself. And right now, human flourishing meant finding a way to help a traumatized little girl access her own voice. She picked up her phone and dialed the main number for the police department. When she was connected to Officer Martinez, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Officer Martinez, this is Judge. I've made a decision regarding the case. I want to move forward with your suggestion about Duke. I need you to work with me to prepare a comprehensive plan for how this would work in the courtroom. I also need you to coordinate with Dr. Sarah, who's been working with the child. And I need all of this done with the utmost discretion and professionalism. Can you do that?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Judge could almost hear the wheels turning in Martinez's mind as he processed what she was asking. "Yes, Your Honor," he finally said. "Absolutely. Duke and I are ready. When do you need this to happen?" "As soon as possible," Judge said. "We have a traumatized child whose voice needs to be heard, and we have a legal system that needs to hear it. Let's make this happen." Over the next 3 weeks, Judge, Officer Martinez, doctor, and the prosecution began coordinating the unprecedented courtroom setup. The therapy dog accommodation would require extensive preparation. There were concerns about courtroom decorum, about precedent, about whether this would even work. But Judge remained firm in her conviction that this was the right path. She drafted an order outlining the accommodation. She had conversations with both the prosecution and the defense about the procedure. She consulted with Emma's therapist about how to ensure the child's. And she waited, hoping that this unconventional approach would provide the breakthrough that everyone, from the legal system to Emma herself, so desperately needed. By early September, everything was in place. Duke had been evaluated and cleared for the courtroom environment. Officer Martinez had trained extensively with the dog to ensure perfect behavior during testimony. Doctor had worked with Emma using visualization techniques and positive associations with dogs to prepare her, as much as a mute traumatized child could be prepared. Judge reviewed all the preparations one final time, and then she issued the trial date. Justice, she hoped, was finally going to have a chance, sat on the edge of Emma's bed in the darkness of their small bedroom, watching her daughter sleep. The in the corner cast a soft blue glow across the room, illuminating the walls decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars that Emma had loved before everything changed. Back then, Emma had talked endlessly about the stars, asking where they went during the day, wondering if they were hot or cold, imagining that fairies lived on them. Had answered each question patiently, delighted by her daughter's curiosity and imagination. Now, those stars just seemed like sad reminders of innocence lost. It was 1:47 a.m. Hadn't slept in 3 days. The trial would begin in approximately 8 hours. Emma would sit in a witness box. She would face the man who had hurt her mother. She would need to find words that had been buried deep in the vault of trauma for 6 months. It seemed impossible. It seemed cruel. It seemed like everything about tomorrow was designed to destroy her daughter all over again. Reached out and gently brushed a strand of golden hair away from Emma's forehead. Even in sleep, her daughter's face held a tension that 3-year-olds shouldn't possess. There were worry lines on her small forehead, and her breathing seemed shallow, as if even her unconscious mind was bracing against unseen threats. Leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of baby shampoo and childhood innocence, things that should have been permanent fixtures of Emma's life, but instead felt increasingly like memories of a person who no longer existed. The apartment was silent around them. His mother had offered to stay for moral support, but had asked her to go home. She needed this night alone with her daughter. She needed to have one more night of normalcy, or as close to normal as their shattered life could get. Tomorrow would be abnormal in ways she couldn't fully prepare for. Tonight, she just wanted to be present with Emma, watching over her like she had every night since she was born. His phone sat on the nightstand, and despite her exhaustion, she picked it up and scrolled through her message thread with her best friend Maria. Their last exchange had been hours ago, Maria sending encouragement that had read but not responded to. Now, at nearly 2 in the morning, typed out a message anyway, knowing Maria probably wouldn't read it until morning. Can't sleep, terrified about tomorrow. What if this doesn't work? What if pushing Emma to testify makes everything worse? What if she gets in there and just shuts down completely? What if Duke doesn't help? What if my daughter has to face that man in court and still can't find her voice? I keep thinking about doctor's warnings about, am I doing the right thing? Hit send and set the phone down. She didn't expect an immediate response, but her phone buzzed seconds later. Maria must have been awake too, or perhaps the notification woke her. You are doing the right thing. You're not forcing Emma. You're giving her tools and support. You're showing her that her voice matters. Whatever happens tomorrow, you're her mother and she knows you love her. That's what will carry her through. Read the message 3 times, drawing what comfort she could from Maria's words. But doubt remained, a constant companion that had moved in after the incident and refused to leave. Had spent 6 months second-guessing every decision. Had she done enough in therapy? Had she been too protective, preventing Emma from working through her trauma? Had she been not protective enough? Was she about to make a catastrophic mistake by bringing Emma to this courtroom? She set the phone down and lay back on the bed next to her sleeping daughter, taking care not to disturb her. Emma had never slept well since the incident. Most nights, she woke up screaming from nightmares, drenched in sweat, her heart racing with panic that seemed to come from some unreachable place. Had gotten used to sleeping very little, used to being jolted awake by her daughter's distress. She existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion that had become her new normal. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, either everything changes or nothing changes, and both possibilities terrified her equally. Her mind drifted to the trial preparation. Judge Chambers had been the setting for a meeting 3 weeks earlier where the therapy dog accommodation had been formally discussed. Had brought Emma, and Officer Martinez had brought Duke. The dog had been calm and gentle, and Emma, silent Emma who hadn't shown much reaction to anything in months, had actually watched Duke with something that might have been interest. The officer had explained how the procedure would work, how Duke would be present but not intrusive, how the dog's steady presence might help Emma feel safer. Some children, Officer Martinez had explained gently, respond to animal companionship in ways they don't respond to human interaction. There's no judgment from an animal, no expectations, just acceptance and presence. Doctor had added her professional perspective. The goal isn't to force Emma to speak. The goal is to create the safest possible environment for her to access speech if she's able to. Some children with selective mutism never fully overcome it in a traditional sense. They learn to manage it, to work around it. But others, when given the right combination of therapeutic support and environmental accommodation, experience breakthroughs. Had wanted to ask, will this work for Emma? But she knew that no one could guarantee that. Therapy and psychology and trauma recovery didn't work according to schedules or guarantees. They worked according to the mysterious timeline of the human mind and heart, which operated according to its own logic. Now lying next to her sleeping daughter allowed herself to imagine the best-case scenario. Emma taking the stand, Duke lying nearby, the prosecutor asking gentle questions, and then the miracle, Emma finding her voice, speaking the truth about what happened, justice being served, and more importantly, Emma beginning to heal because she had finally been heard. Also allowed herself to imagine the worst-case scenario, Emma becoming completely nonverbal, Emma experiencing a panic attack in the courtroom, Duke somehow being blamed for interfering with the proceedings, James walking free because, without Emma's testimony, reasonable doubt prevailed, having to spend years watching her daughter struggle with the knowledge that her abuser had faced no real consequences. Both scenarios felt equally possible at 2 in the morning. His eyes grew heavy despite her racing thoughts. She pulled Emma closer, careful not to wake her, and tried to quiet her mind. She thought about strength, her own strength and the strength her daughter would need tomorrow. She thought about voices and how powerful they were, how a child's simple testimony could change everything. She thought about Duke and hoped the dog would be everything Officer Martinez believed him to be. At some point, exhaustion won out over anxiety and drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of courtrooms and silence, of voices that couldn't be heard and words that needed to be spoken. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer, not to any particular deity, but to the universe itself. Please let Emma be okay. Please let her find her voice. Please let tomorrow be the beginning of healing and not another trauma to overcome. Outside the apartment, the city continued its nighttime rhythms. Traffic moved along distant streets. Someone's dog barked from several blocks away. The night pressed on toward dawn, carrying with it the weight of all the moments that would determine whether tomorrow would be a turning point or another chapter in an ongoing tragedy. Inside the small bedroom, mother and daughter slept fitfully, both dreaming of words unsaid and voices waiting to be found. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse hallway, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Officer Martinez stood in a quiet alcove away from the main traffic of the courthouse, his German Shepherd Duke sitting calmly at his side. The dog was immaculate, his black and tan coat brushed until it gleamed, his collar fitted perfectly but without any indication of aggression or intimidation. To anyone observing them, Duke looked like exactly what he was, not a police dog, but a therapy dog, an instrument of comfort rather than enforcement. Martinez ran through his mental checklist one final time. Duke had eaten that morning, but not so much that he'd be uncomfortable sitting for extended periods. The dog had been taken out for his necessary bathroom breaks. Martinez had walked him through the courthouse hallway yesterday, familiarizing him with the space, the echoing sounds, the different smells. Duke had responded with his typical calm, steady demeanor. Nothing fazed this dog. That was precisely why he'd been selected for this unprecedented role. Looking at Duke, Martinez felt the familiar warmth that came from working with a creature so fundamentally aligned with his own desire to help people. For 4 years, he and Duke had been partners. They'd worked disasters together, been deployed to scenes of human suffering, provided comfort when traditional intervention had failed. Martinez had watched Duke work his quiet magic hundreds of times. He'd seen hardened firefighters soften when Duke placed his head on their knees. He'd watched traumatized children relax just by being in the dog's presence. He'd witnessed the profound healing that could come from non-judgmental companionship. But this, bringing a dog into a courtroom during testimony, this was unprecedented. There was risk here. If Duke misbehaved, if he reacted poorly to the formal atmosphere or the emotional intensity of the proceedings, it could not only hurt Emma's case but could also set back the broader movement toward trauma-informed practices in the legal system. Martinez felt the weight of that responsibility. He'd briefed Judge extensively on Duke's training and reliability. He'd assured her that the dog would behave impeccably. Now, he needed to ensure that his confidence wasn't misplaced. At 8:15 a.m., Judge emerged from her chambers and approached Martinez and Duke in their quiet alcove. She wore her judicial robes, and there was a gravity to her expression that spoke to the significance of what was about to happen. "Officer Martinez," she said formally, extending her hand. They shook and Judge bent down to Duke's level, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. Duke's tail made a gentle waving motion, and he leaned slightly into the Judge's hand, responding with the kind of gentle affection that came naturally to him. Judge smiled, a rare expression that softened the judicial severity of her features. "He's a remarkable animal," she observed. "I can already feel the difference in my own nervous system just being near him. That calming presence you mentioned, it's real." "Duke has a gift," Martinez agreed. "He knows exactly what people need. Today, he'll know that Emma needs safety and presence. He'll provide that without any demand for reciprocation." Judge stood, her expression becoming serious again. "The gallery has been cleared per my order. Only essential personnel are present. The prosecutor, Ms. Santos, is reviewing her questions. The defense attorney, Mr. Richardson, is prepared. The courtroom has been arranged as we discussed. Emma and her mother should be arriving within the hour. I want to ensure everything is in place to give that little girl the best possible chance at being heard." As Judge walked away, Martinez took a deep breath and looked down at Duke. "This is it, partner," he said quietly. "This is why we trained. This is what all those hours and that specialized certification were for. A little girl who needs us." Duke leaned against his leg, and Martinez felt the solid warmth of the dog's body. It grounded him. It reminded him of the fundamental simplicity of what they were about to do. Provide presence, provide safety, provide the non-judgmental companionship that trauma survivors so desperately needed. At 9:00 a.m., and Emma arrived at the courthouse. Emma wore the same pink dress she'd worn for her preparation meeting with Judge, and her hair was arranged neatly with the pink ribbon. She looked like a porcelain doll, beautiful but fragile, as if any sudden movement might cause her to shatter. hand never left Emma's back as they navigated the courthouse hallway toward the designated waiting area. Dr. Sarah was already there, having arrived early to prepare for her role in supporting Emma during testimony. She greeted them warmly and felt some of her anxiety ease slightly. Doctor's presence was grounding, her calm competence a reminder that there were professionals involved who truly understood what Emma needed. "How are you feeling this morning?" Doctor asked, directing the question to both and Emma, but allowing silence as an acceptable answer from Emma. "Terrified," admitted, "but we're ready, at least I think we are." "Emma has been very brave," Doctor said, looking directly at the little girl. "And I'm going to be right there with you. And you're going to see your special friend today, remember, the nice dog we talked about." Emma's eyes flickered at the mention of the dog. It wasn't much, just the smallest indication of awareness, but it was something. Clutched this small sign of engagement like a lifeline. At 9:45 a.m., Officer Martinez brought Duke into the courtroom. The dog walked with perfect heel discipline, his movements controlled and calm. Judge was already seated, and the courtroom had been reconfigured according to her precise specifications. The usual witness stand had been modified. A comfortable mat had been placed in the corner where Duke could lie down within Emma's line of sight, but not in a way that would distract from the proceedings or interfere with courtroom decorum. The prosecutor, Lisa Santos, sat at her table reviewing her notes one final time. She'd spent weeks preparing these questions, consulting with Doctor about how to frame inquiries in a way that wouldn't overwhelm a traumatized 3-year-old. She'd practiced softening her voice, asking open-ended questions rather than leading ones, leaving space for Emma to communicate in whatever way felt manageable. The defense attorney, Michael Richardson, sat across the way. He looked confident in his expensive suit and practiced expression of concern. He didn't believe the dog would change anything. He'd already formed arguments about courtroom disruption and irregularity. He was convinced that without clear, unambiguous testimony from the child, reasonable doubt would prevail. Richardson had been practicing law for 15 years and had learned to view courtroom proceedings as games with winners and losers. He didn't understand, or perhaps didn't want to understand, that what was happening today was about something far more important than winning or losing a case. It was about a child's voice mattering. It was about trauma being witnessed and validated. It was about the legal system bending slightly to accommodate human reality rather than forcing human reality to conform to legal procedure. At 10:00 a.m. exactly, Judge took her seat and called the court to order. She made a brief statement about the accommodation for the therapy dog, explaining that this was a procedure designed to support a child witness in expressing testimony in a courtroom environment. She emphasized that the dog's presence was therapeutic, not investigative, and that his behavior would be monitored continuously. Then she instructed the bailiff to bring Emma into the courtroom. The moment was imminent. Everything they'd prepared for, everything had worried about through sleepless nights, everything that might transform a traumatized child's silence into the beginning of healing. It was all about to begin. Emma entered the courtroom holding Doctor's hand, her small frame dwarfed by the formal space. Her eyes moved around the room, taking in the height of the ceilings, the formal furniture, the stranger in the witness box who was about to ask her impossible questions. And then her gaze landed on Duke. The dog remained perfectly still on his mat, his chin resting on his paws, his warm brown eyes focused entirely on Emma. There was no movement, no demand, no expectation, just presence, just steady, calm, non-judgmental companionship. And something in Emma's tense little face shifted just slightly. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing seemed to deepen. She looked away from Duke to look at her mother, nodded, trying to pour all her love and confidence into that single gesture. Emma walked to the specially prepared chair, climbed up with assistance from the bailiff, and sat facing the prosecutor. Her small feet dangled above the courtroom floor. Her hands gripped the edges of the chair. Her eyes, whenever they strayed from Duke, held the weight of trauma that no 3-year-old should ever carry. The courtroom fell silent, holding its collective breath. Prosecutor Lisa Santos took a breath of her own and began to speak. Her voice, gentle and warm and full of the careful intention she'd been practicing for weeks. "Hi, Emma, my name is Miss Santos." Prosecutor Lisa Santos maintained her warm, measured tone as she began the gentle process of establishing Emma's presence in the courtroom. "I'm just going to ask you some easy questions, okay? There's no wrong answers. You just tell me what you remember, and if you don't remember something, it's okay to say so. Does that sound okay?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but her eyes remained fixed on Duke, as if the dog were an anchor holding her in place while everything else threatened to sweep her away. Santos glanced at Judge, who gave a subtle nod of encouragement. This was expected. Selective mutism didn't mean Emma would immediately begin speaking. It meant finding the right conditions, the right questions, the right timing. Santos had prepared for this. She understood that sometimes silence was a necessary part of the process. "Emma, can you tell me your name?" Santos asked, keeping her voice soft and non-threatening. Silence. Emma's lower lip trembled slightly, but no words emerged. In the gallery behind the protective glass, felt her heart clench. She'd known this was a possibility. She'd been warned that Emma might not speak at all, that the courtroom environment might trigger a complete shutdown rather than breakthrough. But hearing the silence confirmed after so many months of hopping for words was devastating in its own way. Santos continued gently. "That's okay, you don't have to answer right now. Let's talk about something else. Do you have a favorite color?" Again silence, but Emma's eyes continued to track Duke. The dog hadn't moved from his position on the mat, but his tail made a subtle, encouraging movement as if to say, "I'm here, you're safe, you can do this." Defense attorney Michael Richardson leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. This was exactly what he'd predicted. The dog wasn't going to make any difference. The girl was traumatized to the point of complete mutism. Without her testimony, the case fell apart. Reasonable doubt was already written into the record by her inability to communicate. But Judge kept her gaze fixed on Emma, watching with the keen attention that came from decades of observing human behavior. She saw something Richardson didn't see. The slight changes in Emma's body language, the way the girl was gradually relaxing despite her continued silence, the way each moment in Duke's calm presence was slowly, incrementally shifting something in the traumatized child's nervous system. Santos pressed forward with her carefully constructed questions, not forcing Emma to respond, but rather creating a space where response was possible. "Emma, I want to talk to you about a day at the park. Do you remember going to a park with your mommy and daddy?" A flicker in Emma's eyes. Her head turned slightly toward Santos, then back to Duke, then back to Santos again. There was recognition there. The park was being accessed from somewhere in Emma's memory, somewhere behind the walls that trauma had constructed. "It's okay if you don't want to talk about it yet," Santos said, reading the internal struggle playing out across Emma's small face. "We can take our time." Minutes passed. The courtroom held its breath. In the gallery had her hand pressed against the glass partition so hard that her fingers had gone white. She was silently praying, bargaining with whatever force might govern the universe. Please let her speak. Please let her find her voice. Please help my baby. Doctor sat beside, her professional composure intact. But even her trained eye could see the desperation of a mother watching her traumatized daughter struggle against the walls of her own mind. Officer Martinez stood in the doorway, his hand on Duke's collar, his entire being focused on maintaining the therapeutic presence they'd worked so hard to create. The slightest tension in his stance could transmit to Duke, and any disruption in the dog's calm demeanor could shatter the delicate psychological bridge that was slowly forming. Santos shifted her approach, drawing on her preparation with Doctor. "Emma, I'm going to ask you about something that happened, and I want you to know that there are no wrong answers. And if you want to stop at any time, you can tell your mommy or doctor and we'll stop immediately." Okay. Emma's eyes shifted back to the prosecutor. There was something in them, a flicker of consent, perhaps, or resignation, or a child's willingness to try despite overwhelming fear. "Can you tell me what happened when Mommy and Daddy were at the park together?" Santos asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were speaking to Emma in the quiet space between sleep and waking, in that liminal place where trauma sometimes softened enough to release its secrets. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Every person in that room understood they were witnessing a crucial moment, a child's mind deciding whether to break open or remain locked. Emma's small hand gripped the edge of the witness chair. Her eyes filled with tears that began to slide down her cheeks. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. The words were there, trapped somewhere behind her vocal cords, struggling against the psychological force that had kept them imprisoned for 6 months. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, Emma turned her head slightly toward Duke. The dog's warm brown eyes met hers, and in that connection something released. It was as if Duke's calm presence had given permission for Emma to speak, permission to voice the truth, permission to be heard. Emma's mouth opened again. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was barely audible, trembling with the weight of months of silence and the enormity of speaking about trauma that a 3-year-old's mind could barely comprehend. But the words came, each one a small miracle. "Daddy hurt." The courtroom gasped. The sound was collective, involuntary, a room full of people simultaneously witnessing the breaking of a spell that had seemed unbreakable. Judge's eyes filled with tears. Lisa Santos stopped breathing for a moment, then carefully continued, allowing Emma to continue at her own pace, afraid to disrupt the fragile breakthrough that was occurring. Made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Maria, sitting beside her, reached over and squeezed her hand so hard it hurt. Emma, emboldened by having finally released those trapped words, continued speaking. Her voice was small and sometimes hard to hear, but the words kept coming now, like water finally breaking through a dam. She described the shouting Daddy was loud and scary. She described her fear Mommy was scared and I was scared. She described what she'd seen Daddy made Mommy fall down. She described her own reaction I was crying and I wanted Mommy. With each word, Emma glanced at Duke, as if drawing strength from the dog's steady, unchanging presence. Duke never moved, never demanded anything, never reacted with emotion or judgment. He simply was, a living reminder that safety existed, that presence mattered, that sometimes silence could be broken by the quiet companionship of another being. Michael Richardson's confident expression had crumbled. He realized in that moment that the direction of the case had shifted irreversibly. A 3-year-old child, through the power of therapeutic intervention and the extraordinary presence of a trained dog, had done what everyone believed was impossible. She had found her voice. Over the next hour, Emma continued testifying. Her account was not perfectly articulate. She was, after all, 3 years old, but it was clear. It was honest. It was damning to James' defense and validating to every decision had made to protect her daughter and seek justice. By the time Lisa Santos finished her questions, the case against James had shifted from precarious to solid. The girl had been believed, and the entire courtroom had witnessed something remarkable, the healing power of compassion, the transformative potential of accommodation, and the extraordinary strength that a traumatized child possessed when given the right support. As Emma was led from the witness stand, she paused for just a moment and looked back at Duke. The dog's tail made one final, gentle movement. The dog had done his job. He had provided presence. He had held space. He had helped a little girl remember that she was safe enough to speak. And in that small gesture, a dog's tail wagging at a frightened child, lay the entire story of what healing could look like. The verdict came down on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Emma's testimony. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and people who had been following the case since the incident at Riverside Park. Judge sat at her bench, her expression grave and measured as she prepared to deliver the jury's decision. James sat at the defense table, his expensive suit no longer looking quite as confident, his practiced expressions of concern having worn thin over the trial proceedings. Sat in the gallery with her mother on one side and Maria on the other. Emma sat between and Doctor, her small frame nestled against her mother's side. Even now, Emma didn't speak much, but the silence was different now. It was a silence of processing rather than trauma, a silence of a child who was gradually finding her way back to her voice rather than a child locked away in terror. Judge began reading the verdict with deliberate slowness. On the charge of domestic assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple went through the courtroom. On the charge of assault in the presence of a child, we find the defendant guilty. Felt tears beginning to form. On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. The charges continued, one after another, each verdict another brick in the foundation of justice that had seemed so impossible just weeks earlier. By the time Judge finished, James had been convicted on all counts. The man who had assaulted in front of their daughter, the man who had created the trauma that had stolen Emma's voice, had finally been held accountable by a legal system that had found a way to accommodate a child's suffering. Pulled Emma close and whispered, "We did it, baby, we did it." Emma, for the first time in months, smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. The sentencing hearing occurred 5 days later. Judge imposed a substantial sentence, 5 years in prison with an additional 2 years of supervised probation upon release. She also mandated psychological counseling, anger management classes, and a comprehensive parenting assessment before any future custody rights could be considered. But more importantly, in her formal statement from the bench, Judge addressed the broader implications of the case. This court recognizes that traditional procedures for obtaining testimony from traumatized children are often inadequate, Judge stated, her voice carrying the authority of her judicial office. The case demonstrates that trauma-informed approaches, including the use of therapeutic animals when appropriate, can provide traumatized witnesses with the support necessary to access their own voice and express the truth of their experiences. This court is recommending that the state legislature consider formal guidelines for therapeutic animal accommodations in legal proceedings involving child witnesses. What occurred in this courtroom was not a departure from justice. It was justice finally working as it should, in service of human healing and truth-telling. The ruling made headlines. Legal journals picked up the story. Child advocates began citing the case as precedent for their own courtroom innovations, and most importantly, Emma began to heal. In the weeks and months that followed, Emma's progress accelerated. The breakthrough in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted something in her traumatized mind. Having found her voice once, in the place where she'd feared most to use it, she began finding it in other places too. At home, she started speaking in full sentences again. At therapy, she began processing her trauma with words instead of silence. With her friends she gradually returned to the bubbly, curious child she'd been before the incident. Doctor continued seeing Emma twice a week, and the therapeutic focus shifted from breaking through selective mutism to processing and integrating the trauma she'd experienced. Emma is doing remarkable work, Doctor told during one of their joint sessions. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel truly seen and supported. Emma feels both of those things now. Officer Martinez brought Duke to visit Emma weekly, a practice that Judge had explicitly approved as part of Emma's ongoing therapeutic support. These visits became sacred time for Emma, a chance to be near the dog who had helped her find her voice, to process the trauma in the presence of unconditional animal companionship, to gradually reclaim her sense of safety and joy. During one of these visits, Emma sat in her mother's lap, and as Duke rested his head on her knee, she spoke words that made cry. "Duke saved me. Duke helped me talk. Looked at Officer Martinez, tears streaming down her face. He did, she said simply. He really did. 6 months after the verdict, attended a legal conference where judge was speaking about trauma-informed approaches to child testimony. The judge discussed the case in detail, explaining how the therapeutic dog accommodation had functioned as a bridge between Emma's traumatized brain and her ability to communicate. She showed photographs of Duke in the courtroom, explained the extensive preparation that had gone into making the accommodation work, and addressed skeptics who suggested that animal presence in courtrooms was undignified or inappropriate. Justice that ignores human suffering and human need is not justice, Judge told the room full of lawyers and judges. A courtroom procedure that a child in the name of following protocol is a procedure that has failed. The case shows us that we can do better. We can honor both the dignity of legal proceedings and the real needs of traumatized human beings. By the one-year anniversary of the incident at Riverside Park, Emma had transformed dramatically. She still saw Dr. weekly, ongoing therapy that understood would likely be necessary for years, but the selective mutism was completely gone. In fact, Emma had become quite talkative again, filled with the curiosity and joy that she'd possessed before trauma had tried to steal it. One evening, as was tucking Emma into bed, her daughter asked a question that would have been impossible a year earlier. "Mommy, is Daddy going to hurt people again?" Took a breath and answered honestly. "Daddy is going to jail for a long time, and while he's there, he's going to get help learning to manage his anger. Maybe one day he'll get better, but right now you're safe. We're safe, and that's what matters." Emma nodded, processing this information with the kind of developing understanding that came from a child gradually reclaiming her cognitive and emotional footing. "I'm glad Duke helped me," Emma said. "I'm glad I told the truth." "I'm glad too, baby," said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "I'm so proud of you." 2 years after the verdict, the state legislature passed what became known informally as the Emma Act legislation that formally authorized the use of therapeutic animals in courtrooms when testimony involved child witnesses who had experienced trauma. Judge was invited to speak at the bill signing ceremony, and she brought Officer Martinez and Duke with her. In the photographs that circulated afterward, Judge stood between the governor and Officer Martinez, with Duke prominently featured, a German shepherd who had changed the trajectory of legal procedure simply by being present with compassion. The case became a landmark decision cited in courtrooms across the country. Child psychologists used it as a teaching tool. Law schools incorporated it into their curriculum on trauma-informed legal practice. And most importantly, other traumatized children, supported by their own therapeutic animals, found their voices and spoke their truths in courtrooms that had been reshaped by Emma's courage. Often thought about the day at Riverside Park, the moment that had seemed so destructive that healing had felt impossible. Now, 5 years later, she could see that painful moment as a turning point not just in Emma's life, but in the lives of countless children who would benefit from the precedent Emma had set. Her daughter's voice, finally freed after months of silence, had echoed far beyond a single courtroom, creating ripples of change that would help traumatized children for generations to come. Emma, now 8 years old, had resumed her natural curiosity and joy. She excelled in school, maintained friendships, and while she still carried the memories of trauma and continued therapy to process them, she had reclaimed her fundamental sense of safety and possibility. And she had never forgotten Duke, the remarkable dog who had taught her that she was strong enough to speak her truth. Sometimes, when Emma lay in bed unable to sleep, she would think about that moment in the courtroom when she'd looked at Duke and found the courage to say those 2 words, "Daddy hurt." She understood now that those 2 words had saved her mother from further harm, had protected herself and other children, and had fundamentally changed how the legal system thought about supporting trauma survivors. And that understanding, that her voice mattered, that her truth had power, that she could transform her own story from victim to survivor to advocate, became the foundation upon which Emma built her healing and her life. The courtroom had changed her, but not in the way trauma usually changed people. Instead, it had been the beginning of her reclamation of self, her restoration of voice, and her discovery that sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, justice and compassion could work together to transform not just individual lives, but entire systems. The end.